Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar. And what that basically means is that I study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And I've been doing that for many, many years, decades even. And a few years ago, I started using Quora as a way to answer questions. And then we started the YouTube channel about a year and a half ago, and it's been growing wonderfully. And I've been enjoying doing it, and I'm here to answer your questions about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. That means anything regarding The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion, Beren and Luthien, The Fall of Gondolin, The Fall of Numenor, any of his works really, his translations, his academic papers, anything, the languages that he invented, the man himself. I study it all. And if you want to ask a question, you can do so right here in the comment section, and that's just fine. If you want to be featured in a video, though, or if you feel that your question is just not, too long or too involved for a comment, although I've answered long and involved questions there, but if you want to be featured in a video, you're going to want to go to Quora. So Quora is a knowledge sharing platform where you can ask pretty much any question and have people with relevant experience and relevant knowledge answer that question. So there is actually a link to my Quora account in the description of this video, as well as my Quora space, which is called the Grey Havens, and you can go there as well. Or if you're at Quora and you ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, you will get a list of people that you can tag and request their answer. And if you do that, my name is going to be at or near the top of that list, along with some other people who are also great at answering questions. So don't just tag me, tag other people, get a bunch of opinions as well. But definitely tag me if you want to be featured in a video. So we have 10 questions for you today. I think that 10 is pretty much what I'm going to go with. We talked about how I had previously done usually 15 to 20 questions per video, but because we had so many, I was going through them very quickly and sort of rushing. And then I did one where I didn't have as many questions because I did not have that much opportunity to write in the previous week. So what I did was I just did 10 and I made them longer segments, and I asked people, what do you think about that? Do you want me to do longer segments but fewer questions, or shorter segments with many questions? And the overwhelming majority of people who responded said they would prefer the way that I've been doing it the past few weeks, longer segments with fewer questions, although a mix occasionally throwing in shorter questions. Not every question is something that we need to take a very long time to answer, although if you're like me and you're both a Tolkien scholar and a big Tolkien fan, you love talking about J.R.R. Tolkien. So you can see I'm here in the wilderness of Eriador. There's some trolls behind me, but they don't worry about them. They got turned to stone. They just look like they're moving. Gandalf took care of that. Kept them arguing with each other all night, and then the sun came up, and they were like, oh no, this is not good. And then they were stone. Because trolls were created in the First Age before there was a sun. Of course, there was a sun in the First Age, but the vast majority, the last 500 years of the First Age, there was a sun. But the vast majority of it were the years of the trees and the years of the lamps. And there was light the years of the lamps is before the First Age, technically. But the years of the trees, there was light only in the Blessed Realm, in Aemon and Eressëa, the Undying Lands, the uttermost west, whatever you wish to call it. And Middle-earth was dark. Of course, there was starlight, but there was no sun and no moon until the trees were destroyed, and yeah. So here I go already. Quick channel update. We're at 2115 subscribers, which is absolutely fantastic. We're growing. We're getting there. It's been a wild ride. 2115 means there was a point where it was 2112, and I did get to see that. I actually did get to see that. I randomly checked it this morning, and I saw that it was at 2112. And I was like, oh, let me get a screenshot before somebody else subscribes. And I showed it to a few people. Like, look, we are the priests at the temples of Syrinx. If you get the reference, let me know. I think a lot of you will get the reference. I think that the Venn diagram of people who are watching a Tolkien channel and people who get that reference is it's not quite a circle, but it's nearly a circle. It's an oval. There's a lot of overlap there. You'll notice I don't have the headphones on because the headphones have a blue glow and they kind of screw with the green screen a little. So we're just doing that. There's still a little bit of fuzziness around the edges, and I really can't do much about that, but I'm pretty happy with how it's all working out right now. I think to get rid of that, I would just need a new webcam, which is something that we're going to look at some point. I'm going to need to be making more money on YouTube to be able to justify like an even better webcam than what I already have, which is pretty good. You know, it's not like I need to replace it, but I would like to replace it somewhere down the line. So, you know, when the channel grows even more, we'll do that. Is there anything else I wanted to talk about before I get into the reading? Let's see. Quora itself. So I've been continuing to work with the Quora staff on improving Quora, and they just let me know that some changes had gone through, really good positive stuff, and kind of give us a roadmap of what to expect that they're working on. And the big news is that there are now less AI-generated questions on the platform. They don't want to completely get rid of the AI-generated questions. They have their own reasoning for it. Personally, I'd rather if every question on the platform was written by a real person, and I very rarely feature AI questions here on the YouTube channel. We did one, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, but it was sort of to demonstrate a point about how it is improving, but it's still a little weird. So that's the quick update on Quora itself. I think that's pretty much it. We'll get into the reading. I'm going to read you a little bit of The Hobbit, and since I'm sitting here in the chapter that is basically the roast mutton chapter, I decided to read you a bit of the roast mutton chapter, which is sort of Bilbo's first real adventure. He has agreed, or really been coerced into going on this adventure with these dwarves, and Gandalf as well. And at first he's sort of like, oh, this isn't so bad. I'm riding on a pony and seeing people that I've never seen and going to places that I've never gone to. But then it becomes uncomfortable and they kind of get lost and they're running low on food. And they see a light in the distance and it's a fire, and they decide to see if the people there might be friendly, and maybe might want to share or barter for some food so that they can continue their journey. Bilbo goes there and he sees that there are trolls. Now, he has not come into the One Ring yet. He does not have the ability to make himself invisible, but hobbits are rather naturally sneaky, as is covered in the preface to The Hobbit. And he knows that the smart move is to just go back to the dwarves and say, no, there's trolls there. Bad move, let's just, give them a pretty wide berth and avoid them. But then he starts to think that his role in this party adventure is that of a burglar. And as a burglar, he thinks that he would be expected to steal something from the trolls. So he tries to do that, and he gets caught, and it leads to a great misadventure. And of course, it is good that this happens, because after the trolls are dealt with and they're turned to stone, after Gandalf returns, they go and they say, well, the trolls had to have somewhere nearby that they could hide from the sun, because they were created before the sun, and they can't stand the sun. They were created by Morgoth. And his creations don't like light. The trolls are killed by it. The orcs are not killed by it, but they do find it painful and uncomfortable. They can't really travel or fight during the day, so they're pretty much nocturnal creatures in that sense. They're not like vampires where they'd be like burned by the sun, but they find it very, very uncomfortable. But trolls are outright just destroyed by it. They go back to what they were, which is stone. But anyway, it's a good thing that this happened, because they go into the trolls' horde, and they do find some food that they could use, but most importantly, the swords, the weapons that they find, which are from Gondolin, which turn out to be, the sword that Gandalf chooses is called the Glamdring, which is foe hammer. It was King Turgon's sword. And then Thorin Oakenshield takes a sword that is called Orcrist, which is... we don't know exactly whose sword it was, but it was a very important sword in Gondolin, and it was likely Ecthelion that would have used it, I would think. And then there is a little dagger that becomes Bilbo's sword, Sting, which of course Frodo winds up inheriting later. Sam uses it to fight Shelob. It's a pretty important sword. in The Lord of the Rings especially, but also in the Hobbit. I mean, it's not named Sting at this point. It doesn't have a name. It's not an important weapon like Glamdring and Orcrist, but Bilbo gives it that name after he uses it to kill giant spiders in Mirkwood Forest, which is a few chapters later. But anyway, it's a good thing because the swords are very important, especially the ones that Bilbo uses and the one that Gandalf uses. Gandalf uses his to kill a Balrog in The Lord of the Rings. That's really important. So, let's read a little bit of Roast Mutton, which is only the second chapter, so showing you that they really do get into it very quickly. I want to kind of start at the point where Bilbo gets caught. Yeah, this'll work. Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow, said one of the trolls. Never a blinking bit of man-flesh we've had for long enough, said a second. What the hell William was a-thinking of to bring us to these parts, it all beats me, and the drink running short, what's more, he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William choked. Shut your mouth, he said as soon as he could. You can't expect folk to stop here forever just to be et by you and Bert. You've had a village and a half between you since we came down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up our way when you'd have thought, thank you, Bill, for a nice bit of fat valley mutton like what this is. He took a big bite of a sheep's leg he was roasting and wiped his lips on his sleeve. Yes, I am afraid that trolls do behave like that, even though those with only one head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try roasted dwarf or even pony for a change, or else he should have done a bit of good quick burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked the trolls' pockets. It is nearly always worthwhile if you can manage it. Pinched the very mutton off the spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their noticing him. Others, more practical but with less professional pride, would perhaps have stuck a dagger into each of them before they observed it. Then the night could have been spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read of a good many things he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorin and company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of course, of the various burglarious proceedings he had heard about, picking the troll's pockets seemed the least difficult. So at last he crept behind a tree just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked up the courage and put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo. Ha! Thought he, warming to this new work as he lifted it carefully out. This is a beginning. It was. Trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no exception. Hey, who are you? It squeaked, and left the pocket. And William turned round at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind the tree. Blimey, Bert, look what I've caught, said William. What is it? Said the others, coming up. Lumme if I knows, what are you? Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit, said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him. A hobbit, said they, a bit startled. Trolls are slow in the uptake and mighty suspicious about anything new to them. What's a hobbit got to do with my pocket anyway, said William. And can you cook 'em, said Tom. You can try, said Bert, picking up a skewer. I wouldn't make above a mouthful, said William, who had already had a fine supper. Not when he was skinned and boned. Perhaps there are more like him round about, and we might make a pie, said Bert. Hey, you, are there any more of you sort of sneaking around in these here woods, you nasty little rabbit? He said, looking at the hobbit's furry feet. And he picked him up by the toes and shook him. Yes, lots, said Bilbo, before he remembered not to give his friends away. No, not at all. Not one, he said immediately afterwards. What do you mean, said Bert, holding him right way up, by the hair this time. "What I say," said Bilbo, gasping, "and please don't cook me, kind sirs. I'm a good cook myself, and cook better than I cook, if you see what I mean. I'll cook beautifully for you, a perfectly beautiful breakfast for you, if only you won't have me for supper." "Poor little blighter," said William. He already had as much supper as he could hold, and he had lots of beer. "Poor little blighter. Let him go." "Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all," said Bert. "I don't want to have me throat cut in my sleep. Hold his toes to the fire till he talks." "I won't have it," said William. "I caught him anyway." "You're a fat fool, William," said Bert. "As I've said afore this evening, and you're a lout." "And I won't take that from you, Bill Huggins," said Bert, and puts his fist in William's eye. Then there was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left when Bert dropped him on the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet, before they were fighting like dogs and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in one another's arms and rolling nearly into the fire, kicking and thumping, while Tom whacked at them both with a branch to bring them to their senses, and that of course only made them madder than ever. This would have been the time for Bilbo to have left, but his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round, so there he lay for a while panting, just outside the circle of firelight. Right in the middle of the fire came up Balin. The dwarves had heard noises from a distance, and after waiting some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one to creep towards the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarves uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately, and "A sack, Tom, quick," they said. Before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening, a sack was over his head and he was down. "He's more to come yet," said Tom, "or almighty mistook. Lots and none at all it is," said he. "No better hobbits, but lots of these here dwarves. That's about the shape of it." "I reckon you're right," said Bert, "and we best get out of the light." And so they did, with sacks in their hands they used for carrying off mutton and other plunder. They waited in the shadows, as each dwarf came up and looked at the fire and the spilled jugs and the gnawed mutton, and surprise, pop, went a nasty, smelly sack over his head, and he was down. Soon Dwalin lay by Balin, and Fili and Killy together, and Dori and Nori and Ori all in a heap, and Oin and Gloin and Bifur and Bofer and Bomber piled uncomfortably near the fire. "That'll teach 'em," said Tom, for Bifur and Bomber had given a lot of trouble and fought like mad, as dwarves will when cornered. Thorin came last, and he was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief, and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell him that things were not at all well. He stood outside in the shadows some way off and said, "What's all this trouble? Who's been knocking my people about?" "It's trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They had forgotten all about him. "They're hiding in the bushes with sacks," said he. "Oh, are they?" said Thorin. And he jumped forward to the fire before they could leap on him. He caught up a big branch all on fire at one end, and Bert got that end in the eye before he could step aside. That put him out of the battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught hold of Tom's leg, as well as he could. It was thick as a young tree trunk. But he was sent spinning up from the top of some bushes when Tom kicked the sparks up in Thorin's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that, and lost one of the front ones. It made him howl, I can tell you. But just at that moment, William came up behind him and popped a sack right over Thorin's head and down to his toes. And so the fight ended. A nice pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks, with 3 angry trolls and 2 with burns and bashes to remember sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly, or mince them fine and boil them, or just sit on them one by one and squash them into jelly, and Bilbo up in a bush, with his clothes and his skin torn, not daring to move for fear they should hear him. So that's where I'll stop. A few comments here. One interesting thing here is the narrator, which is, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien in the sense that the narration is his author voice, but in universe, it's Bilbo who is telling this story. Now, we know that, in The Lord of the Rings, that Bilbo wrote down his memoirs, the story of his adventure, and he called it There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale. And of course, he didn't write down the truth. There was one section that he was especially untruthful. That was Riddles in the Dark, which is a later chapter, which is involves Gollum and the One Ring. Of course, when he wrote it, he didn't know it was the One Ring. But he wrote a version of it that was the same as what he told the dwarves and Gandalf as to who Gollum was and what Gollum was like and how he came to obtain the ring. It was a very different tale, and that was actually the tale as Tolkien originally wrote it and how it was published in the first edition. But of course, this is the revised edition. I might even say that somewhere on here. It doesn't say it on the cover, but I think if I go in here, it will say it at some point. The Hobbit or There and Back Again by J.R. Tolkien, illustrated by the author, Boston, Houghton, Mifflin Company, 1979. That's not it. I know at some point it does say revised. I don't know where it says that. Interesting. Maybe it's on the back. I don't know where it says it. But most of the revised editions do say it. My other copy, which is a much, much smaller and much rattier paperback, does say revised edition. And this is indeed the revised edition. But that was not the only instance of Bilbo not really telling the truth. If you read Unfinished Tales, there's a section of it called The Quest for Erebor, which has Gandalf talking to Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin and Gimli. And this is sometime during the events of The Return of the King, specifically Book 6, where it is after the destruction of the One Ring, sometime around when Aragorn was being crowned and the wedding was going to happen, but before they set off to Rohan, where they would attend Theoden's funeral and then eventually depart to the north to return to the Shire. But anyway, the reason I bring that up is that Gandalf states that there were other parts of Bilbo's tale that were just simply exaggerated or toned down or just not true. He brings up, for example, that Thorin was quite a lot nastier than what Bilbo betrayed him as, and he doesn't know whether it was because Bilbo was sort of oblivious to the way that he was being spoken to and how disrespectful Thorin was to him in his own home, or because he decided to portray Thorin as nicer than he was because in the end he did become close friends with him and he respected him and he didn't want him to come off poorly in the story, even if he would get redeemed towards the end. So there are multiple sort of ideas there, but we could tell that this story is a lot of made-up nonsense that Bilbo came up with. I do believe that, in the context of what actually happened in Bilbo's adventure, he certainly came across some trolls. There certainly was a fight. They certainly were captured, and then Gandalf got them arguing until daylight broke and they turned to stone. But the names is really interesting. The fact that they have these very English-sounding names of Bert and William and Tom. And at one point, I'm bringing this up now, it's revealed that one of them has a last name. I think it was, Bill. Bill Huggins is what Bert calls him. And this is interesting because it's sort of difficult to think of trolls as having family structures and surnames and things like that. Now, Huggins could be some sort of epesse, like a name, a second name that means something sort of like Legolas Greenleaf. He's not Legolas of the Greenleaf family. As a matter of fact, the name Legolas means Greenleaf, so it's sort of like saying Legolas, or sort of saying Legolas and then telling people what that means. We don't get a lot of surnames in Middle-earth. Elves very rarely use them. You hear of things like Arwen Undumiel, but Undumiel is just sort of like a title, an epesse, a nickname, so to speak. It means Evenstar. So you hear things like that. Elrond Perithel is just half-elf, things like that. Men usually just have one name. Sometimes they are of the House of X. Aragorn has a lot of names, but they're not like a first name and a last name. He's just Aragorn, son of Arathorn. In the end, he takes the name Elisar, and he does come up with a family name, Telkantar, which roughly translates to Strider. The transliteration is more to bring something across or to travel. It was the closest you can come to the word Strider, and that was what he chose for his family name. But that doesn't mean that his son, Eldarion, is Eldarion Telcontar. It just means that he is Eldarion of the House of Telcontar, for example. The only characters that we see that have these structures of first and last names are the Hobbits. And considering that as a Hobbit telling this story, it seems that the idea that they had these ridiculous, very English-sounding names of Bill and Tom and Bert, and Bill's last name even being Huggins is an invention of Bilbo's. He also mentioned something about a lot of trolls having more than one head, which is something that never comes up again. It's never mentioned at any point. There's a lot of things in The Hobbit that are never mentioned again, like giants, although I could talk about, where Tolkien went with that and sort of the early drafts and stuff. That's a whole nother discussion that I don't have time for today. But those are sort of the interesting things to talk about here. And we can tell that Bilbo is being fanciful. He's telling the story to people that he knows, and he's writing it down. He's telling it to his young cousins and his nieces and his nephews and, people like Frodo and Sam and such. And writing it all down to publish as a book, which he eventually does, and it becomes the first chapter of the Red Book of Westmarch, of which there are 3 main sections. There's There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale by Bilbo Baggins. There's The Downfall of the Lord of the Rings and The Return of the King, written mostly by Frodo Baggins, but also by the other hobbits. It's really a tale of 5 hobbits and the accounts of the wise. And the final part is Translations of Elvish Lore, translated by Bilbo Baggins, which is really the Silmarillion. There were some other things that were added in there, like the Tale of Aragorn and Arwen, which was in the Thane's copy, and things like that. But the main Red Book of Westmarch is really just those 3 things. Anyway, we have 10 questions to get to, so we're going to get to them. And if you like the content so far, I will ask that you subscribe, and I will ask you again to subscribe at the end of the video, because if you're like right now, like, well, I don't know, it seems kind of cool, he seems to know his stuff, but I don't know if I want to subscribe and see this every week, I'll ask you again at the end, because if you reach the end of this video, then you're willing to sit around and listen to me talk about this for an hour or more, then you definitely want to subscribe. So I'll remind you again then. Anyway, let's get to your first question. Our first question comes in from Wynne Griffiths, who asks, which version of elves do you think is correct? Those from Tolkien's fantasy world, Santa's helpers, or Harry Potter's house elf? So I'm going to be honest with you here. I think it's kind of silly to even think that there might be a correct version of a mythological being such as an elf. But this ridiculous notion was actually around even when Tolkien wrote his stories, and it led to some issues for him. Tolkien's elves are physically identical to mortal men, the only difference in appearance being that they are always beautiful, and that elf men aren't as rugged as mortal men. Of course, they are tough as mortal men, sometimes more so, but they appear nearly identical to the elf women. Tolkien had the idea that elvish ears might be slightly pointed, not to the degree portrayed in art or in the films, but slightly more leaf-shaped than those of mortal men. The big difference is, of course, a spiritual one. Elves are immortal and men are mortal. Tolkien's idea of how elves are is today so prevalent that it seems odd to see small, weird creatures like in Harry Potter. But the fact is, there really isn't a correct way of depicting elves. Elves go back to Norse and Germanic mythology, which depict them in various ways. And like Tolkien, they have different types of elves. I can, if I wish to, sit here and rattle off dozens of different types of elves across mythology and fiction and general media, some of which might align more with Tolkien's idea, and many of which do not align at all with his idea. Tolkien actually faced these issues early on. He did not want anyone to think that his elves were the same as, for example, Santa's helpers, though in the Father Christmas letters, he played with the idea that those elves actually do share a lot of similarities with his own. He had ideas for different types of fey creatures, but he called them things like gnomes and fairies. In one of his earliest stories to feature elves, which is Beren and Luthien, Beren is referred to by Tevildo as an elf, while Luthien is referred to as a fairy, though Beren is also referred to as a gnome. We are to understand that they are both elves in this early version of the story, but that fairies and gnomes are just different types of elf. Gnome became the later Noldo, as Tolkien's friends couldn't get the thought of garden gnomes out of their heads. So, thinking that he meant Beren to be this diminutive little creature with a beard. Eventually, gnome was dropped altogether, along with the gnomish language, which later became Sindarin. And of course, in later revisions of the tale, Beren was not any kind of fey creature. He was a mortal man. There is a reason that in The Hobbit, which was the first book published to have his version of elves in it, he goes through great lengths to describe what they actually are. Because if he just leaves it up to, what people in the 1930s thought of elves, they might be thinking of something like Santa's Little Helpers, or they might be thinking of something like the Germanic elves. So he doesn't want you to think of tiny creatures. He doesn't want you to think of childlike imps. Because at the time that he was publishing The Hobbit, that was sort of the common thought of what elves were, and he was doing something a little different and a little more unusual. Now, after 50 years, not after 50 years, but 50 years after his death in the 70s, his version is now one of the most popular versions of elves out here, though I would say it's tempered a bit by on-screen adaptation that gives them long, knife-shaped ears like Star Trek Vulcans. And even though that's not necessarily accurate, it's more accurate than what we had before. If you were to look at the Rankin Bass Hobbit, for example, and I know I got to get back to my analysis of that at some point. I just have to find the time for it, as well as the Hobbit on GameCube playthrough. But if you look at the version of Thranduil from it, like Elrond looks like just a guy, and then you get to Mirkwood, and Thranduil is sort of like a goblin-like creature, because that's what a lot of people thought elves looked like. Just because Tolkien's version of them is so popular doesn't leave room for other versions to exist and thrive even. To some, elves will always be childlike imps. To others, they are demonic, alien-type creatures. And to others, they are ethereal. Tolkien didn't invent elves. He just had a specific version of elves that he used in his stories, much like anyone does. Since you mentioned Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling was basically... She wasn't really using elves. She was using kobolds. We talked about kobolds in the last episode when we were talking about translation of Goblin and translation of Hobbit. She basically used kobolds and just called them elves. But she toned down the kobolds' more cruel streak. But if she had called them kobolds, then people would wonder why they're not very cruel, or perhaps they would wonder why they're not more like the kobolds seen in something like Dungeons and Dragons. So whenever you're writing about like fey creatures like this, you have to sort of think about, okay, how does the general public view these creatures? So if you're writing a story about elves, and they're not like Tolkien's elves, which is sort of the most popular version right now, you're going to have to be very descriptive in saying what they look like and what they are like, their nature and everything. So, like I said, there's not really a correct version, because it's like every culture out there has a version of elves, just like every culture out there has a version of vampires, for example. And they're all different. And they're all, valid, because they're stories and myths and legends about all of them. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Brandon Lane, who asks, how powerful are the Valar compared to the Ainur who did not enter Ea? So to just break this down for anyone who doesn't know what some of those words mean, the Valar means the powers, and it is sort of the 15 greatest angels in the world. And they sort of function as a pantheon of gods. They're not literally gods, but they sort of function in that case. Ainur means angel, or transliterated as Holy One. So Valar is a type of Ainur. The ones who are not Valar are called Maiar, which means beautiful. Ea is the world, or rather the created world, the universe. So we can't know really the direct answer to this question, because we don't know about the ones that didn't enter the world. We don't know their names, we don't know their nature, we really don't know any of them except for the ones that did indeed enter into the created world. The idea of there being classifications of Ainur did not exist prior to the creation of the world. They were all just one large group. There was, of course, some that were mightier than others, as Iluvatar himself points out. He states the Ainur are mighty, and Melkor the mightiest among them. Upon entering into the created world, the elves came up with the different names to describe them. The 15 greatest they called Valar, it means powers, and even among these, they called the greatest 9 the Aratar, which means the high ones. All non-Valar Ainur were referred to as Maiar, which, as I mentioned, means beautiful. There isn't a lot of groupings of Maiar, though they're usually associated with one of the Valar, or in the case of Aloran, several of them. Melkor, later called Morgoth, was considered both Vala and Arata, but he was later removed from their order in the Elvish chronicle Valaquenta. This is the opinion of the elves. However, as Morgoth says to Feanor, he's still a Vala. And Feanor even agrees with this, not because he's accepting of Morgoth, he's anything but accepting of Morgoth, but rather because he feels the others are no better than Morgoth. Remember that the entirety of the Silmarillion is seen through the lens of the elves. And they were the ones that came up with all these sort of different words and concepts and classifications. If all of the Ainur entered the world, then perhaps there would have been more Valar and more Aratar. There likely are Ainur outside of the world that are on a similar level of power to Manwë or Varda, but going by what Iluvatar said, none as mighty as Melkor. There are likely just as diverse in terms of power as the ones that did enter the world in terms of their might and their wisdom and their beauty. So I would say that we can't really know. It's not like only the greatest ones went into the world. It was the ones that wanted to go to the world. I do tend to think, and this is theorizing at this point, that most of the very powerful ones entered the world because they probably had the most say in how the world was created. The ones with the loudest voices during the Ainulindala, which is the song of the angels that created the universe. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Kumali Kokavali, who asks, did Aragorn speak Quenya? How many non-Noldorians speak Quenya? So Aragorn likely spoke both of the most prominent Elvish languages, though he likely also would have been more comfortable with Sindarin than Quenya. Not that he can't speak Quenya, but that he's probably more conversational in Sindarin than he is in Quenya. Both Sindarin and Quenya were forks of the original Elvish language, which was called Quendian, which literally means to speak, while Quenya means belonging to the speakers. And Sindarin is, ironically enough, Sindarin is actually a Quenya word that's used to describe the language of the Sindar. Quenya was the more prominent language of the elves that migrated to the Undying Lands, while Sindarin was developed in Middle-earth. Not that every elf in Middle-earth necessarily spoke Sindarin, but it was very popular. When the Noldor refugees and exiles came to Middle-earth, they of course did speak Quenya, but they learned Sindarin to communicate with their brethren in Middle-earth, especially the elves of Doriath, who were forbidden to speak Quenya. Mortal men developed their own speech, but the root of the early speech of mortal men was Elvish as well, as they learned the language of the Avari, which are the elves that never even tried to go to the west. But also, they spoke Sindarin and they spoke Quenya as needed. Númenóreans of the Second Age were able to speak both languages, but they seemed to favor Sindarin, even developing their own dialect of Sindarin. Later, the unfaithful of Númenor developed their own language, Adonaic, which, while the faithful continued to speak Sindarin, though of course they, in their own dialect. Thus, the Gondor Sindarin later would be a language that Aragorn would be very comfortable with, which was derived from the Numenor Sindarin. And with Elrond being Aragorn's foster father, he would have knowledge of the more proper Sindarin Elvish, and he would know Quenya as well. It is significant to note that Aragorn gave his sword a Quenya name. He called it Anduril, stating that it means Flame of the West. Now, the transliteration of Anduril is closer to brilliance of the sunset, with the understanding that the sun sets in the west, and the sunset can look like flames. Aragorn, taking such a poetic approach to naming his sword, would tell me that he has a very good grasp on Quenya. He has no issue communicating with elves that would speak Sindarin, most notably Legolas, who's a Sindar prince, nor does he have issues communicating with elves that would speak Quenya, such as Galadriel, who's an old lady. Due to his time spent in Gondor in his youth as Thorongil, which itself is a Sindarin name, he would be very familiar with the Gondor dialect of Sindarin. Now, as for how many non-Noldorians speak Quenya, you have to remember that the Sindar traditionally don't speak Quenya because their original king, Ilúthingol, banned it. And the reason he banned it was because the Noldor were murderers as far as he concerned. Now, he had a soft spot for Galadriel, and one of Galadriel's brothers, Finrod, they both stayed in Doriath for a time, and they learned Sindarin, of course, because that was the language. And he said, I won't let that language be spoken in my realm. So we can say that it is likely that the Sindar leaders that came to places like Lothlorien, which was Celeborn, and Mirkwood, which would be originally Orifur, and then of course Thranduil and Legolas, they would speak Sindarin, and they probably didn't speak Quenya. However, I would say that all of the elves in places like Rivendell and Lindon speak Quenya, and guys like Aragorn would know Quenya, and guys who are scholars like Faramir, for example. Gandalf certainly spoke Quenya. All of the wizards, I would say, would speak Quenya because they're from the West, and it's a very popular language in the West. So I would say also that it's likely that Quenya probably started to disappear a little bit more in the Third Age, but it probably got a resurgence in the Fourth Age. And this is surmise, but the reason I'm saying this is because in the Fourth Age is when the Silmarillion was available to read in Westron, because Bilbo's translation of it was available. And I think this would have sparked a lot of interest in scholars in places like Gondor and Rohan to learn Quenya and to explore even more Elvish lore. But that's surmise. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Adam Gorowski, who asks a very fun question. Who had a better relationship with the big bad of their series, Count Dooku or Saruman? So, Count Dooku, also known as Darth Tyrannus, is an excellent example of George Lucas being bad at names. As good as Tolkien is at coming up with names, George Lucas is just terrible. I mean, this guy in the original Star Wars had a chubby guy named Porkins. In one of the later films, he had a drug dealer named Elend Sleaze Bagano. He's just really terrible at coming up with names. I heard a story of I don't know if it was a video game or a novel or something where they said, could we have like a Sith Lord with a Darth name? And this was before the prequel, so there was really only Darth Vader and Darth Sidious, and we didn't even know Darth Sidious's name. We just knew him as Palpatine, and he said, yes, but you must call him either Darth Vomitus or Darth Icky. And it's just like, well, you know what, never mind, man. We're not doing that. So he's just bad at names. Sometimes I think he's bad at names on purpose, but yeah. But aside from Dooku being this perfect example of George Lucas being terrible at coming up with names, He's basically Saruman. He's basically Lucas putting one of Tolkien's characters, or heavily inspired by one of Tolkien's characters, into one of his films. Now, I want to get this out of the way. In no way am I basing the fact that I'm saying Dooku and Saruman are very similar on the fact that they were both played by Christopher Lee. This does help to highlight the similarities, but it's more due to Lucas being rather fond of casting actors who had appeared in Hammer horror films. We'd already seen this with the likes of David Prowse and Peter Cushing. So the fact that Christopher Lee had played both Frankenstein's monster and Dracula in those films was more likely significant to Lucas than the fact that he had played Saruman the White. However, this doesn't erase the fact that Dooku essentially is Saruman in a lot of ways. He's a former member of a noble order of peacekeeping mystics that went astray and fell in with the Dark Lord, only to be later thrown under the bus. The only real difference is their final fate. They diverged at the end of their stories. Dooku, was directly betrayed by his master and executed by a Jedi, specifically as a means to corrupt that specific Jedi, while Saruman fled and was murdered by his own servant. If Star Wars had followed The Lord of the Rings very closely, Dooku would have escaped, and he would have wound up on Tatooine and probably tried to, harass Anakin's family there and the community around them, and then he would have been killed by like a droid or something. But the similarity is also in the fact that both Saruman is not loved by Sauron and Dooku is not loved by Palpatine. We are never really told exactly how loyal Dooku is or whether he's using Palpatine as a means to an end, but both he and Saruman are being used as a means to an end. Lucas follows a very similar thought to Tolkien in one important philosophical aspect of storytelling, and that is that evil is never cooperative. The relationship between the Sith is never equal. There's always one that's the master over the other, and they're not only expected to betray each other, but it's sort of encouraged that they do this. We even see an antagonist in one of the later films betray another antagonist to the point where he actually helped the protagonist just out of sheer spite. Now, Tolkien wouldn't go that far. And he didn't when the opportunity presented itself. Saruman was offered conditional pardon by Gandalf the White, and he rejected it. He would not help Gandalf, not even despite Sauron, who left him hanging out to dry, and would likely kill him at the earliest opportunity. Instead, Saruman just became increasingly petty and malicious, enacting his revenge on the smallest of his enemies, and admitting that it was out of sheer spite. I would say that Saruman is largely influential on the character of Dooku, though of course their paths diverge in a rather pointed way. I would say that as far as directly answering the question, I would guess that Dooku probably has the better relationship with Palpatine than Saruman had with Sauron. If we look at the moment in that film where Palpatine tells Anakin to kill Dooku, the look of shock and betrayal on Christopher Lee's face is very palpable. I was once told, and I don't know how true this is, I'm not a Star Wars scholar by any means. I was once told that an earlier version of the script had Dooku's final words be directed at Palpatine, and it was something along the lines of, "You promised me amnesty," or something very similar to that. That was more Ian McKellen than Christopher. Let me try again. "You promised me amnesty." That's not great, but it's closer. Saruman is actively working against Sauron. He's just doing it in the worst possible way by sort of pretending to join him, and Sauron is not fooled. He knows that he's only pretending to join him, but he thinks of Saruman as a useful idiot, somebody who could bother his enemies and cause some strife and sort of help him achieve his goals. He's never going to let him get close to him. He's never going to trust him. In the sense of comparing them, I would say that Dooku is closer to being a true believer. At the very least, he didn't expect to be betrayed, which really he should have. If you know a little bit about Star Wars, like I said earlier, the Sith are sort of expected to betray each other. So the fact that it was a surprise to him tells me that he's not very wise. He lacks wisdom. And Saruman lacked wisdom in some ways too. But in some ways, he was sort of smart enough to see where the wind was blowing. He just let his pettiness and his vengeful streak and his maliciousness override all of his intelligence and wisdom. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Billy Godfavor Birdos, who asks, does Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin know about Morgoth? If so, what will be their reaction? I'm not sure about what will be their reaction. I mean, I guess I can answer that. It's just an interesting way of phrasing the question. They all know of Morgoth, but to them, he was a character in a story based on events that happened a very, very long time ago. At the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, the only hobbit that we can say for sure knows anything about Morgoth would be none of the ones that you mentioned in the question, but rather Bilbo Baggins. Bilbo spent a lot of his time with elves, and in the previous sojourn to Rivendell, it was said that he was told many stories of elvish history, though he did not know that they were real histories. He thought they were stories. Bilbo wrote some poetry inspired by the elvish tales of the First Age. The poem Errantry, I did a reading of that once, is an example of such. Later, as he lived in Rivendell after leaving the Shire, he would know more about Morgoth than any other non-elf or wizard in Middle-earth, as he was the one that translated the Silmarillion from various elvish languages to the common speech. The others learned about Morgoth from a story as well, one told by Aragorn. Aragorn told the hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, a little bit of the story The Lay of Leithian, which we know better as Beren and Luthien. This included the important part where the couple go to Angband to steal a Silmaril from the Dark Lord's crown. Aragorn does not mention Morgoth's name. He calls him the Great Enemy or the Dark Lord, but they do understand that he is not speaking about Sauron. The only character in Lord of the Rings to directly say Morgoth's name, or at least the name that the elves gave him, which is Morgoth, is Legolas. But he is referred to by other characters as the Dark Lord, which is what Treebeard says, and Aragorn, as I mentioned, called him the Great Enemy. While we don't really know what lessons or Merry and Pippin took from the story, that's, I guess, how I would interpret the part of this question that says what will be their reaction, is what lessons did they take of hearing about Morgoth. For Merry and Pippin, we don't really know, but they were at least told the story. Frodo, for his part, understood Aragorn better after meeting Arwen, and he understood the connection between Aragorn and Beren and the connection between Arwen and Luthien. He grasps what the Lay of Leithian means to Aragorn, so I would say that Frodo's takeaway from it is more about Beren and Luthien and not so much about Morgoth. Sam, he makes a rather direct connection between this tale of the Silmarillion and the adventure that he's having, and he does this at two different parts of the story. I'm going to read you a little bit of the Return of the King here. I wonder, said Frodo, but I don't know. And that's the way of a real tale. Take any one that you're fond of. You may know or guess what kind of a tale it is, happy ending or sad ending, but the people in it don't know. And you don't want them to. No, sir, of course not. Beren now. He never thought he was going to get that Silmaril from the Iron Crown in Thangorodrim. And yet he did. And that was a worse place and a blacker danger than ours. But that's a long tale, of course, and goes on past the happiness and into grief and beyond it. And the Silmaril went on and became Eärendil. And why, sir, I never thought of that before. We've got some of the light of it in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's still going on. Don't the great tales never end? No, they never end as tales, said Frodo. But the people in them come and go when their part's ended. Our part will end later, or sooner. And then we have some rest and some sleep, said Sam. He laughed grimly. And I mean just that, Mr. Frodo. I mean plain ordinary rest and sleep, and waking up to a morning's work in the garden. I'm afraid that's all I'm hoping for all the time. All the big, important plans are not for my sort. Still, I wonder if we shall ever be put into songs or tales. We're in one, of course, but I mean put into words, told by the fireside, or read out of the great big book with red and black letters, years and years afterward. And people will say, let's hear about Frodo and the Ring. And they'll say, yes, that's one of my favorite stories. Frodo was very brave, wasn't he, Dad? Yes, my boy, the famousest of the hobbits, and that's saying a lot. "It's saying a lot too much," said Frodo, and he laughed, a long, clear laugh from his heart. Such a sound had not been heard in those places since Sauron came to Middle-earth. To Sam suddenly it seemed as if all the stones were listening, and the tall rocks leaning over them, but Frodo did not heed them. He laughed again. "Why, Sam," he said, "to hear you somehow makes me as merry as if the story was already written. But you've left out one of the chief characters, Samwise the Stout-Hearted. I want to hear more about Sam, Dad. Why didn't they put more of him in this talk, Dad? That's what I like. It makes me laugh. And Frodo wouldn't have gotten far without Sam, would he, Dad?" "Now, Mr. Frodo," said Sam, "you shouldn't make fun. I was serious." So this bit, which is from the chapter The Stairs of Cirith Ungol, demonstrates that Sam has realized that the Silmarillion is not just a historical text, a story long since ended, but that he is now in that story. And this is true on a very literal level. The final chapter of the published version of the Silmarillion is Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. I read a bit of that last week. It's a very abbreviated recap of the first two ages, followed by an abbreviated accounting of the Lord of the Rings. We can see the story being told in not very much detail by the elves, while the Lord of the Rings is the much more detailed version written by hobbits. Sam does not directly mention Morgoth, but he mentions Thangorodrim, which is the triple peaks where Angband was seated, and the Iron Crown that sat atop Morgoth's head, and of course the Silmarils that were set into the Iron Crown by Morgoth. He even makes the connection between the light of the Silmarils, itself a mingling of the lights of Lorel and Telperion, and the light in the Starglass, the Phial of Galadriel that Frodo has. This is important as the Phial was instrumental in the undoing of Shelob, the daughter of Ungoliant, who along with Morgoth destroyed Lorelin and Telperion. We see the child of the light of the trees defeating the child of the one who drank up their light and extinguished it. Now, the second bit that I'm going to read you is a bit shorter, and it's from the chapter The Field of Cormallen. "They stood now, and Sam, still holding his master's hand, caressed it. He sighed. 'What a tale we have been in, Mr. Frodo, haven't we?' he said. 'I wish I could hear it all. Do you think they'll say, "Now comes the story of Nine-Fingered Frodo and the Ring of Doom"? And then everyone will hush, like we did when in Rivendell they told us the tale of Beren One-Hand and the Great Jewel. I wish I could hear it, and I wonder how it will go on after our part.'" So here, Sam makes a direct comparison between Frodo and Beren, even giving Frodo the nickname Nine-Fingered Frodo, comparing it to Beren One-Hand. Both went on a seemingly impossible task and came out of it maimed, Beren having his hand bitten off by a werewolf and Frodo having his finger bitten off by Gollum. Both of these biting events have long-reaching consequences, though it was better for Frodo, as a finger was a small thing to give up for the destruction of the One Ring. In Beren's case, losing his hand in such a fashion led to much destruction in Doriath and his eventual death, though he was returned to life, the only mortal man to die and then return, at least in Tolkien's Legendarium. Merry and Pippin are, in the very least, peripherally aware of Morgoth from hearing some of the Lay of Leithian from Aragorn, but that is as far as it goes. As they were both literate, aristocratic hobbits who stayed in Middle-earth until their deaths, even having the honor of being buried on either side of Aragorn, and in fact wrote parts of the Red Book of Westmarch, one section being what we understand as the Lord of the Rings, it seems to me likely that they would have read Bilbo's translations of Elvish lore, the Silmarillion, and would become quite knowledgeable regarding Morgoth later in their lives. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Eric Miraz, who asks, "Did any of the Rings of Power beside the One Ring have the power of invisibility?" Almost certainly not, though the issue is somewhat muddled by Gandalf's words on the matter. We have to remember that the Rings of Power were not like the One Ring. They were made by the elves, and they were made for the elves, while Sauron created his ring for no one other than himself. It did not necessarily confer the power of invisibility as such, but rather, if worn by an incarnate, would shunt them partially into a spiritual realm that most cannot actually see. There are exceptions to this, of course. The Nazgul, living totally in the spiritual realm, which Tolkien called the Wraith world, can not only see one who wears the One Ring, but they can see that person much clearer than anyone else, as they have some difficulty perceiving living beings. The power of the ring is the power of domination over others. The invisibility is just a byproduct of it being designed for an angel, not a person. And I say partially for two reasons. One is that they're still very solid and can interact with things, and when somebody puts on the ring, their effects, their clothes and everything become invisible as well. And the other reason is they're not really completely invisible. I would say they're like 99% invisible. It doesn't really come into play in The Lord of the Rings, mostly because Frodo doesn't really wear the ring all that much. But in The Hobbit, where Bilbo is like, once he gets it, he's using it like all the time, it's mentioned that you can see a person who's wearing the One Ring if they're standing in very, very bright light, like very direct sunlight, or like next to a fire or something like that. And you're seeing like kind of a pale, shadowy figure. Like you can see through them, but you can kind of see them. And this, this happens to Bilbo as he's escaping from under the Misty Mountains. He gets like stuck in the door. He's not strong enough to move the stone door, and he's not thin enough to squeak through that little tiny opening. And he gets stuck for a while, and there's a very bright light there coming from the natural light and the fire. And the orcs, the goblins, they see him. They see something. They say there's something by the door, and then he manages to squeeze through, losing all his buttons. So the Rings of Power were all designed for elves, while the three, Narya and Vilya and Nenya, they're different in that they were made by Celebrimbor alone with no help or supervision from Sauron, and their power is more focused on protection against evil. But they were still created with the same magic. Gil-galad, Círdan, and Galadriel are not invisible when they wear the rings. Neither are the later Elrond and Gandalf, who may be an angel, but he's temporarily incarnate. The rings aren't made for spirits, they're made for people. Gandalf did say something to Frodo that confuses the matter, which I'll read a little bit of that here. Immortal Frodo, who keeps one of the great rings, does not die, but he does not grow old. He does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues, until at last every minute is a weariness, and if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes in the end invisible permanently and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. Yes, sooner or later if he is strong or well-meaning to begin with, but neither strength nor purpose will last. Sooner or later the dark power will devour him. Gandalf here suggests that specifically mortals can use the rings to make himself invisible, and this can lead to fading, becoming permanently invisible, the fate of the Nazgul. There are two reasons why Gandalf is essentially incorrect here, the literary reason and then the practical reason. The literary reason is that Gandalf says a lot of things to Frodo that are just sort of true in spirit. He speaks to Frodo in words that he knows Frodo will understand, and uses a lot of creativity to not freak the poor hobbit out too much. One such example is describing Smeagol's people as akin to the fathers of the Stoors, making it seem as if the river people not only predated modern hobbits, but they were similar to hobbits. In fact, the Shire itself is much older than Gollum's people. The river people once lived in Bree-land, and they lived in the Shire, and they were not akin to the fathers of the Stoors. They were Stoors, who remigrated to their point of origin, going back to a more primitive way of life. Frodo even rejects the idea that Gollum could ever have been anything like a hobbit. Being told that he was just straight up a hobbit would have upset him greatly. And he does realize it later on in the story, but at this point he's not really ready to hear it. Tolkien explains in his letters that Gandalf is sort of softening the blow, getting Frodo used to the idea that he shares something in common with this wicked creature that Frodo only knows of as a character from Bilbo's book. It is also possible that Gandalf, in speaking about the mortals who later became the Nazgul, is theorizing that their rings may have had the power to make them invisible, but I believe Gandalf is just trying to get Frodo to the point without bogging him down in a mountain of lore, explaining that these rings, and particularly the one that Frodo has, are dangerous. It is possible that he was just saying using them is dangerous and using invisibility as an example that is relevant to Frodo because that's what he sees his ring as doing. Now, the practical example here is that The Lord of the Rings was rather rushed by Tolkien standards. He spent 2 decades writing it, but he felt that it was too short and it had too many errors at publication. Adding to this point is the fact that the chapter that this is set in, the Shadow of the Past, is very old. It's the first bit of the book that was ever written. And some of the things that Tolkien would later explain as Gandalf being creative may very well have been more straightforward in the intention of writing at the time, and Tolkien did not have the time to revise it. Tolkien was a perfectionist, and he was a procrastinator, and he was never happy with the fiction that he published, even The Hobbit. He revised it greatly ahead of the publication of The Lord of the Rings, and then later he considered doing a full rewrite of The Hobbit from the ground up to make it more congruous with The Lord of the Rings, but he was talked out of that, with the reasoning being that The Hobbit is special because it's unique and it's not The Lord of the Rings. It's its own thing. None of Tolkien's other work in his legendarium was published within his lifetime. The thousands of pages of backstory and lore were all left to be cobbled together by his son Christopher and other notable scholars to publish over the years. If given unlimited time to perfect The Lord of the Rings, who knows what shape or hue the Shadow of the Past would have taken on, but then again, I tend to think if he was left with unlimited time, he just never would have published it at all. He never would have finished it. So there you have it. Let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from the Oski Boski asks, was Sauron ever in person to Minas Morgul? I suppose you're asking, did he ever actually go there? Keeping in mind this answer, any answer to such a question, lies solely in the realm of surmise. I would say that it is unlikely that Sauron ever personally visited Minas Morgul. There is a theme that you can see in Tolkien's work regarding leadership in evil circles versus leadership in good circles. The good leaders are in front of their armies. The bad ones are in the back, or not there at all. In The Lord of the Rings, the examples are pretty overt. The good leaders being Gandalf, Aragorn, Theoden, Éomer, and Imrahil. They all fight on the field of battle in front of their armies, not behind them. Denethor, he gets a pass. He's not a bad leader. He's a good leader who was caught in a moment of madness induced by Sauron via the Palantir. And he is, as steward, actually forbidden from partaking personally in battle. This was the law in Gondor. By comparison, the evil leaders, Sauron and Saruman, sit in their towers, and they let their enemies march ahead of them. The only evil leader that we see out in the field of battle is the Witch King. But this is tempered by 2 thoughts. The first being that he has no choice, and the other being that during the Battle of Pelennor Fields, he is attempting to invade Minas Tirith and assassinate Denethor or Aragorn, rather than fighting the army of Gondor. Once he finds himself with enemies on both sides of him, Gandalf in front of him, Theoden coming from behind, he flees from Gandalf to attack the weaker leader, and even then he does not actually directly fight or strike down Theoden. Theoden dies as a result of his horse falling on him after being caught up in the Witch King's fear aura. Saruman does not travel to Helm's Deep, but only attacks the least of his enemies, hobbits, and he hides behind his ruffians. Sauron only leaves Barad-dûr to attack once it's already too late, and his defeat is assured. And this scene exists mostly as a way of letting us know that, yes, he really is defeated in a very permanent manner, or as I would say, as permanent a matter as he can be. Sauron would go out and fight when he was not the leader, but a lackey of Morgoth. But those days are long past. In the Second Age, he attacked out of desperation and wound up losing the One Ring. But before this, he capitulated to his enemy Numenor and allowed himself to be captured because, as fearsome as he can be, his skill set is more key to subterfuge and seclusion than a fight. We know that when Minas Ithil fell, the Ithil Palantir was believed lost, though many of the wise feared that it wound up in Sauron's hands, but it is likely that it was just brought to him in Barad-dûr rather than him actually going there and finding it. While Tolkien did not come up with the title of the Two Towers to describe the second volume of The Lord of the Rings, and he actually didn't like that title, it does give us an image that I feel is useful. The evil characters stay in their towers while the good ones charge forward in battle. So unless he had a hankering to visit Minas Morgul for some reason, I doubt that he ever really left his tower once he returned there after being ousted from Mirkwood, at least not until he lunged at Gandalf and Aragorn and Imrahil and then blew away on the wind. Considering his ability to see very far, both through the Palantir and the Eye of Sauron, if there was anything of interest to him in Minas Morgul, he could just order it to be brought to him. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Brian Reynolds, who asks, at the final battle at the Black Gate, Aragorn was almost killed by a troll, but was spared due to the destruction of the One Ring. Had Aragorn died, would Faramir have sat as the ruler or steward of Gondor? So I suppose the lead up to this about the troll and everything is movie specific, because that didn't happen in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. But the answer remains the same anyway. The idea of Aragorn almost being killed by a troll, it seems like a bit of an odd choice, both storytelling-wise and cinematic-wise, but it's because in that scene he was originally fighting Sauron. Peter Jackson envisioned, storyboarded, and even partially filmed a scene in which Sauron appears at the Black Gate and Aragorn fights him. You can watch this on YouTube, cobbled together from unused footage, test footage, rehearsals, and even some crude animation. The special effects for Sauron aren't finished, as Peter Jackson abandoned the idea before it was completed. However, a lot of the footage was used just with the CGI Sauron being covered up with a CGI troll. So now you know why in the film Aragorn has such a hard time with a troll. When Viggo was filming the scene, he was not thinking that he was fighting a troll, he was thinking he was fighting Sauron, the Dark Lord himself. The animated parts even show that this was happening simultaneously to the destruction of the One Ring, and Aragorn is saved by the bell when the ring is destroyed and Sauron explodes. Some of the animation actually predated Viggo's casting or even Stuart Townsend's casting as Aragorn, as the storyboard Aragorn is based off of the version from the Ralph Bakshi animated feature, The Lord of the Rings. In the book, though, Aragorn doesn't fight a troll specifically, but he does stand alongside Gandalf and Imrahil in battle, fighting the forces of Sauron. The only character that we're specifically told fights a troll in that chapter is actually Pippin, and he kills the troll with his barrow blade, though the troll then falls on him, almost kills him. Luckily for Pippin, Gimli comes and rescues him. If Aragorn had died in that scene, the book and the subsequent film would not be called The Return of the King, but it is true that the line of ruling stewards would probably continue. Aragorn had no living relatives at this point. It was said that Halbarad was a kinsman of some sort to Aragorn, likely an heir of Isildur himself, but probably a cousin, and he may not have been descended from an Aryan. And of course, he didn't fulfill all the prophecies that Aragorn had fulfilled. And it's pointless to talk about that anyway, because Halbarad died already in an earlier battle. So in the scenario of Aragorn dying at the Black Gate, Faramir, once he recovered, would be the ruling steward, and he would almost certainly pass this title down to his son Elberron. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So this next question comes in from somebody who on Quora decided that their name was going to be Remember Bubblebutt, which, hey, you know, whatever you're into. And this person asks, what happened to the 3 elf rings, 7 dwarf rings, and 9 human rings? Did any of them exist after Frodo destroyed the One Ring? So I could, of course, answer this, but I have to clear up a few misconceptions that are in the question. There are 2 misconceptions in the question, and both of them are somewhat understandable, coming from, you know, somebody who might be just a casual fan of The Lord of the Rings. The first is that Frodo destroyed the One Ring. He didn't. No one could destroy the One Ring willingly. This was made clear pretty early on in the story. It could be destroyed specifically at Sammath Naur, but no one really had the will to cast it into the fire. The only character that I could personally imagine actually doing it would be Bombadil, but he wouldn't go there. He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't leave the domain that he carved out for himself in the Old Forest. If we're to give credit to a single person for destroying the One Ring, it would be Gollum. Frodo claimed the ring at the seat of its power, which was actually enough to get Sauron's attention. So if Gollum had not acted, Sauron would have assuredly recovered the ring. Gollum did not take the ring with the purpose of destroying it, but his actions did lead to its destruction nonetheless. Gandalf said early on in the chapter The Shadow of the Past, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the oldest section of the book as the chronology of writing goes, that Gollum had a part to play, for good or for ill. Gandalf was a student of Quenya, who preached the virtues of patience and pity and mercy, all things that Gollum received, and due to Gollum receiving patience and pity and mercy, he was alive to be there at the crucial moment, so it was patience, pity, and mercy that saved Middle-earth. The second misconception is that there were human rings and dwarf rings. Though the rings of power wound up being split up that way, that 3 elves, 9 men, and 7 dwarves had them, they weren't created for that purpose. All of the rings of power, except the One Ring, were made by the elves and for the elves. Once Sauron stole 16 of them, 3 escaped his grasp, he divvied them out to dwarves and men as an attempt to control powerful dwarves and men with his ring, which was largely only successful with the men. Upon the destruction of the One Ring, out of the 16 rings of power, there were only 15, out of the 19 rings of power, because there were the extra 3, there were only 15 that were left existing. 4 of the rings had been held by dwarf lords, and they were destroyed by dragons previous to the Lord of the Rings. So the other 3 were recovered by Sauron. The 9 he gave to men were either held by the men themselves, the Nazgul, or by Sauron. And this is one of those things that Tolkien was never really clear on who actually was in physical possession of those rings. I talked about that last week. But either way, they were accounted for. The remaining 3 were accounted for as well. Frodo knew that Quenya was held by Galadriel, as she showed it to him in Lothlorien, but he didn't know the location of the other 2. The rings that were still intact all existed after the One Ring was destroyed, but they had no more power. They were bound to the One, and as it passed, so too did the rings of power. They were, for all intents and purposes, just jewelry at this point. If the Nazgul held their rings, 8 of them were left scattered around Mount Doom, and they were probably destroyed in the eruption, with the last one laying somewhere forgotten in Pelennor Fields. If Sauron had them, they were likely either destroyed or rendered unrecoverable by the collapse of his tower, along with the 3 that he took back from the dwarves. The last 3, Narya and Quenya and Vilya, were accounted for in the chapter The Grey Havens. The narrator at this point is Sam, and he clearly sees Quenya on Galadriel's finger. He was not able to see it before, but now the ring is no longer magic. He can see it clearly. He sees Vilya on Elrond's hand, and he sees Narya on Gandalf's hand. So the 3 rings made by Celebrimbor passed into the uttermost west, the Undying Lands, possibly to even maybe be delivered to Celebrimbor himself. It should be noted that everyone who ever bore a ring of power winds up either dead or in the west, with the last bearer left in Middle-earth being Círdan, who sails to the west at some point later in the Fourth Age, along with Celeborn. The only exception to this would be Sauron, who can neither die nor return to Valinor, and he must remain in Middle-earth as nothing more than an ill wind. And now we're going to move on to your final question. Our final question comes in from Link of Wise, who asks, if the Uruk-hai were much better than regular orcs, why did Sauron and Morgoth not use them as much as Saruman? So Saruman created the Uruk-hai, and the results are clear. They are not better than regular Uruks. Uruk-hai is a term that transliterates as goblin folk. It translates as goblin men. They are hybrids of Uruks, which is just the black speech word for orc or goblin, and mortal men that Saruman came up with this whole idea. He wished for Uruk warriors who would be fully loyal to him, as he was their father in the sense that he facilitated their breeding, and he would also be able to have them fight and travel under the sunlight. The Uruk-hai were not around when Morgoth was, and Sauron didn't think much of them. The results at Helm's Deep speak for themselves. Individual Uruk-hai are bigger and stronger than the average goblin, which is why when it comes to a fight over, what to do with captured hobbits, it's the Uruk-hai that overpower the Black Uruks of Mordor. They do also have the advantage of stamina and the ability to travel and fight during the daytime. The other advantage is their loyalty to Saruman. They think of him as their father. They call him Sharku, which means old man. It's the closest that we can get to them calling him dad. Sauron doesn't have that loyalty from his troops, but he doesn't need or really care about that. He rules through fear and magic coercion. The disadvantage of the Uruk-hai is that they're kind of dim. This is more the fault of Saruman than anything. He was no great war leader, and he did not train them properly. They were mighty, but they made severe tactical errors, and their lack of discipline led to them stopping to pillage, which allowed Theoden to successfully entrench his forces at Helm's Deep. They also were easily stymied by being flanked, which we see on a few occasions, but most notably at Helm's Deep when Gandalf and Erkenbrand arrived behind them. They flew into a panic and fled into this forest that wasn't there a moment ago, that was of course the Huorn army that Treebeard brought. They didn't kill anyone important at Helm's Deep, and compare that to Sauron's forces at Pelennor. Sauron's Uruk-hai are likely fairly young guys compared to Sauron's more seasoned orcs. Sauron's orcs may be smaller and with a weakness to sunlight. Lucky for them, Sauron can just blot out the sun. But they are craftier and they can think on their feet more. Of course, while Uruk-hai are something specifically that Saruman came up with, it seems likely that there were orc-men hybrids in the past. Some of Sauron's breeding stock wound up producing what Tolkien called half-orcs, which were more man than orc, and they were rather successful as spies in places like Bree. The Hobbits later recognized that some of the unsavory southerners that they had previously met in Bree had likely had some goblin ancestry. So if you want to know how such a thing happens without Saruman facilitating it, I would present to you an anecdote that was straight out of the comment section, not here on YouTube, it was on Quora. One person in a comment found it hard to believe that any mortal man would willingly couple with an orc. And then another person replied and said, well, you haven't met my brother-in-law. Amusing? Yes. True to life? Yeah, probably. I mean, like I said, we don't really know what the goblin women look like, but you know that no matter what, there's at least some men out there who would say, yeah, would. That being said, it's interesting that every time I bring this up that it was Saruman who created the Uruk-hai, not Sauron. There are people who tell me I'm wrong, and this happens like every time, and they say, no, Sauron created the first Uruk-hai. And I always ask the same question, can you point out where in the book it says that? Because it doesn't. And the only thing that I've ever seen that said that Sauron ever created Uruk-hai was on one of the wikis. Now, a friend of mine once stated that every fandom that grows to a certain size, and with Tolkien it's very big, has 2 wikis. And without fail, one of them is seen as the good wiki and the other is seen as the bad wiki. Now, for Tolkien, the 2 wikis that I'm referring to are, one is called the Tolkien Gateway, and the other is called the One Wiki to Rule Them All. There's probably other ones, but those are like sort of the 2 main ones. Now, I don't recommend using wikis as sources for research. If you just want to look something up real quick, have a question that you have in your head, and maybe it's on there, right? But always make sure you check those sources too, because that's really important. For real research, you have to have the actual books that Tolkien wrote, including the History of Middle-earth, which is 12 volumes, and then the Nature of Middle-earth, and the History of the Hobbit, which is 2 volumes, and all this other stuff. So there's a lot out there, and universally, I would say that the one wiki to rule them all is the bad wiki, while the Tolkien Gateway is the good wiki. That's not to say it's perfect. I've seen plenty of mistakes on the Tolkien Gateway. And no, I don't edit it. I don't really care to. When I notice an error, I just go, well, that's wrong, and then I don't bother with it because I'm not really a wiki sort of person. But sometimes I'll see, I'll look up something because I won't remember a name. That's like the big thing. I always confuse Anduhur and Orifer, and sometimes I'll just bring up the Tolkien Gateway to say, okay, which one was Gil-galad's dad, and which one was Thranduil's dad, and that's like the main thing that I'll use it for when I need a name, and I can't remember the name. Like when I was researching the question about what happens if Aragorn died, His kinsman, Halbarad, I couldn't remember his name, so I used the wiki for that. I was like, who was that guy? And in my mind, I kept saying Baragon, but I'm like, I know it's not Baragon because he was the keeper of the keys at Minas Tirith. He wasn't a ranger of the north. What was that guy's name? So I brought up the Tolkien gateway and I typed in the Grey Company, and there it was. It said Halbarad. I'm like, of course, Halbarad. So that's what it's very useful for, but you can't really use it as a source, especially the one wiki to rule them all, because that one has a lot of really just fan fiction stuff in there. And I remember somebody like getting into a big argument about the Uruk-hai, and I was saying that no, they were just Saruman's thing, not Sauron. And this guy was insisting that Sauron created them, and he showed me a screenshot of the one wiki to rule them all that said that. But I said, you notice there's no source there. You have to show me where in the books. So in this, answer, that the one that I just read out to you, of course, that still happened. And I got a guy named Alex who said, Saruman did not create the concept of Uruk-hai. Sauron did. Need to read the text again because Saruman learned it from Sauron. Not true. Who had plenty of them. Not true. What Saruman did was breed a new form of Uruk-hai, and even then, that isn't clear that they are innately different. So I just told him, no, that's not in the book. It's in one of the wikis, but it doesn't have a source. So Alex replied to me, and he said, well, it's in History of Middle-earth, and it's in the letters, and it's in the appendix of The Lord of the Ring, where he says that it conquered Ithilien. Now, I don't just have these books as physical books. Like, there's a bunch of them over here, there's one over there, there's a few down there, and there's a few behind my green screen. But I have digital copies of all these books as well, so I can search for things very quickly. And so he mentioned the History of Middle-earth, which is 12 volumes. I'm not searching through all that. But he mentioned the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien and the appendix of The Lord of the Rings. And I searched specifically for these things just to show him, like, no, you're either misremembering or you're just trying to justify something that you read in a wiki that isn't true. So I brought out my digital copy of The Lord of the Rings and I searched for Uruk-hai. And, of course, it comes up a lot. Well, it only comes up like 8 times, actually. And, the only mention of Uruk-hai in the appendix just mentions that they referred to the lesser Uruks, lesser meaning smaller in this instance. They refer to them as Snaga, and that Snaga means slave. There is no mention of Uruk-hai conquering Ithilien. As a matter of fact, it explicitly states on page 1051 that it was the Nazgul who conquered Ithilien. Uruk-hai are not mentioned at all. The letters, also incorrect. Now, Uruk-hai with the dash in it doesn't come up in the letters at all, but I found that what Tolkien did in his letters, he didn't use the dash, he just used it as one long word, Uruk-hai. And he only mentions Uruk-hai twice in his letters. And they were both in letters to his son. And in the first, he uses a metaphor. He says, you are a hobbit amongst the Uruk-hai. And then in a subsequent letter to his son, who must have, I guess, taken it the wrong way, we aren't given Christopher Tolkien's letters to his father, just his father's letters to him and of course to many other people. He says, no, that's really just a figure of speech. There aren't really a such thing as Uruks. I'm just using that as a metaphor. So, yeah, he doesn't mention that in the letters. It's not in The Lord of the Rings. As for the History of Middle-earth, I'm not going to sit there searching through 12 volumes of it. If somebody wants to say, oh, it's in Morgoth's Ring, then tell me it's in Morgoth's Ring. If they want to say it's in the Peoples of Middle-earth, then say it's in the Peoples of Middle-earth, and I'll happily bring it up and search it, and yeah, it's not there. Tolkien never stated that Sauron created the Uruk-hai. He created the Uruks, and I think the mistake here that people make, and this is the reason this keeps coming up every time I talk about this, is just the word Uruk. There's another comment that I got that I want to show. Where is it? Morpheus Sandman said, Sauron made the first Uruks. They attacked Osgiliath in 2480. Now, notice, he didn't say Uruk-hai. He said Uruk. Because Saruman's armies are referred to almost exclusively as Uruk-hai, one character, Gamling the Old, calls them Goblin Men, which is just a translation. People think Uruk refers specifically to those guys, but no, all orcs are Uruks. I said, no, Sauron didn't make the first Uruks. Morgoth made the first Uruks. Uruk is just the word orc in the Black Speech. That's all it is. Sauron created the Black Speech, so in that way he created the word Uruk, but orcs, Uruks, whatever you want to call them, goblins, they were created by Morgoth. And the Uruk-hai are a specific type that was bred, I wouldn't say even created, but bred by Saruman. The good wiki refers to it as refining them, which doesn't mean that they already existed and that he made them better. It's just that he refined goblins into this specific form, the Uruk-hai, which was short-lived because they all died. So yeah, it didn't last very long. I don't think a lot of the Uruk-hai are out there wandering around. But like I said, this is one of those things that people continually argue with me about. And I'm not saying it's wrong to argue with me, but you really have to have a source that isn't a wiki. If you want to say, on this page it says this, or in this book it says that, I would rather you say what page or at least what chapter it says it, so that I can easily access it. But if you can't just say it's in History of Middle-earth and expect me to just take you at your word, because that's 12 big books. And if you're not going to tell me which one, I'm not going to sit there searching through all 12. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. But this guy who was having this discussion with me is 0 for 2, because he said it was in the letters and it's not in the letters, and he said it was in the appendix and it's not in the appendix. There's only one mention of Uruk-hai in the appendix, and just saying that they called the other orcs Snaga, which is interesting. And I mentioned the loyalty to Saruman and everything, is that all of the orcs that serve Sauron are his slaves, whereas all of the orcs that serve Saruman think of themselves more of his children, and they're not really his slave. I mean, they are. They totally are his slaves, but they don't see it that way. They're not bright enough to realize that. They like Saruman. That's the thing. The orcs don't like Sauron, but the Uruk-hai do like Saruman. And so in their heads, they're like, I'm here by choice. They're not really, but they think they are, because if they had a choice, they would probably be with Saruman. Anyway, that's all the questions this week. I had a lot of fun, as you can tell. What's really interesting is that when I started recording this, I had a massive headache, and it has faded to a not so massive headache. So this really shows that there is a therapeutic aspect of talking about things that you love, and I certainly love this stuff. So if you have questions for me, well, you guys know what to do. You can go on Quora, or you can go right in the description. The link to my Quora is in the description, or you could, I meant to say, go to the comments. You can go to the comments and ask me questions there. Or even if you don't have a question, leave me a comment. Hit the like button. Help me feed the algorithm. Suggest the channel to other people that may be interested. If you haven't subscribed, I said I would remind you. You got to the end of the video, you got to subscribe. It's in the bylaws. I don't make the rules. I'm half joking here. But seriously, if you made it all the way through this, you obviously want to see more of my content. So go ahead and hit the subscribe button if you hadn't already. Make sure you go through all the hoops that YouTube makes you jump through, including hitting the bell and turning on notifications and blah, 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 blah. Consider membership. Membership helps me out a lot. It's a paid membership. And with that, you get some emotes, which will become relevant as I do streams on here, which is going to happen very, very soon. And you get all the videos early. So that's really cool. You get all the videos at least a week early, some of them more so. And like I said, it just helps me out. So consider that, and I'll see you guys next time.